So Paz, I'm really pleased that you were able to join us for this. You've got a lot of experience in this area. And I decided I wanted to focus on microaggressions. I mean, microaggressions apply to all LGBTQ or GSRD people. And in fact, everybody else in many ways experience microaggressions when friends and family you look down their nose at us for something. But I think trans people experience this, and it's in my view a much higher rate. And I thought it would be very helpful to have both you and Antonio focusing on that for us, and really being aware of how in the therapy room we are manifesting microaggressions with the best of intentions, but they're kind of inevitable, and that it would be helpful for us to learn more about that, and what we can be doing about this. So I'm delighted that you're here, and please do carry on and give us your presentation.
Great, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited, and I was really excited to see that people are really, in terms of their practices, are working with a lot of gender diverse clients, and I think that that's a really important thing to think about. I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen. Think that. Sorry, you can see it okay?
Yeah, that's good, thank you.
Okay, great. So yeah, what I'm actually going to focus on is talking about two different studies today that have been conducted in my lab, working specifically with trans and non-binary clients. But I think that a lot of what we're talking about will work, and I've actually looked at some of the literature in terms of clients who are coming, who are consensual, non-monogamous, and a lot of their experiences with therapists are very similar. I think that a lot of sexual minorities also experience this with therapists as well. And so I'm going to focus in on trans and non-binary clients, but I think that there's a lot of ways that we can think about how all of our diverse clients might be experiencing this in the therapy room and outside of that as well. So I'm just going to position myself for a second. My name is Paz Galupo. I'm a faculty member at Towson University in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States. I use she and they interchangeably in terms of my pronouns. And my research is really focused on looking at the intersection of sexual orientation and gender diversity. And what I'm really interested in is non-binary experiences of identities, because I think that places us outside of all expectations, because so much of how we think about gender and sexuality relies on this binary kind of conceptualization. And that works in terms of thinking about identity. It works in terms of thinking about appearance, right? So even if we're talking about LGBT individuals, sometimes these types of microaggressions also happen for people who just present in non-conforming ways. And so there's ways that I like kind of your terminology, because it's really expanding the idea of how we think about diversity. And so I tend to focus on identity, but a lot of times our identities, part of the issues that we get socially is because our identities aren't easily read by other people or understood by other people, because we expect our appearance and our identities to somehow align, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. And so there's a lot of ways to think about diversity as we think about how we wear and experience and identify in terms of gender and sexuality. So one of the things that in doing my own research, I really am so interested in focusing on lived experience. I'm interested in talking to people within community and understanding how their experience translate, and then getting that into the research literature, getting that into the hands of practitioners so that they really understand people within our communities and kind of how they experience the world. And so one of the interesting things about my research then is when I'm talking to people who are not therapists, who are not researchers, who are just kind of in the community, their reaction to my research is, yeah, we all know that. Like in the community. And sometimes that's hard for me to hear, because I'm like, this is such important research. And then I get queer people being like, you wrote a paper on that? Like, I lived that every day, you know? So they feel like this is known. But the thing for me is that when researchers or clinicians read it, they're like, I had no idea. I didn't know this is how people were kind of experiencing the world. And so for me, what I try to do is take everyday common experiences, and this is very true of microaggressions, they're everyday common experiences that kind of happen, and try to understand the impact and try to help professionals understand how that really impacts people within the community, their lives and their experiences. And in this case, in terms of their experiences in therapy. And so it's interesting for me identifying within the community, also trying to capture experiences in the community, and then trying to get it out there into the world for people who are working with individuals within the community as well. And so I just wanted to kind of position myself and my identity. So I identify as biracial. I'm Filipino, half white. I identify as agender, pansexual. I am married. I have 3 children, and we live in a intergenerational, multiracial household. So that's pretty challenging at times in the US, where there's so much racial tension happening and racial violence happening as well. And so these are, when I'm thinking about microaggressions, and I'm thinking about it, and I'll let you hear kind of from my participants, but when I'm thinking about it, it's also part of my lived reality. And it's when I conducted this research with my students who all identify differently, it's part of their lived reality too. So doing this research was also a labor of an emotional labor for having to read and honor these experiences, but then also there's a process of kind of having to relive the trauma yourself when you're reading it. And so I'm just going to kind of warn you a little bit about hearing the power of the words. I'm not going to talk, I will talk a tiny bit about theory at the beginning, but really what I want you to do is just hear the experiences of the participants to understand really what clients are bringing in to their relationships with their therapists, and kind of how they're experiencing that world in a particular way. So I'm just going to give a little bit, and I apologize that most of these statistics are US based. There's a little bit of Europe, but I think that they're not that different overall. And this is just kind of a slide. And I know that you've been participating in this, so you know very well why this is important. But I just think starting with statistics is helpful for why affirmative counseling and affirmative therapy is really important. In the US, 77% of trans and non-binary individuals desire therapy, but of those, only 58% actually receive it. So I think that's an important thing to think about. So when we're thinking about trans and non-binary individuals, not everybody that you're seeing is everybody that needs therapy, right? They're the people who have more access. They're the people who are more privileged, who can get themselves there. And not only get themselves physically there and financially there, but emotionally put themselves kind of in your care. And I think that's something that's really important to do, because often just coming to therapy and being vulnerable is a difficult place to be. The therapy that we have is largely ineffective. So 33% of the individuals that were surveyed had a negative experience within the last year. 24 of them were in a position to have to educate their therapist about their experiences. 15% were asked inappropriate questions. 18% experienced having their therapist try to stop them from being trans. And then 8% were refused care. So that's a pretty grim picture. And then we also know that often once somebody has a negative experience, then they don't try to participate in therapy again. It's enough to kind of rebuff them. So there's if you're thinking about this, not every trans and non-binary person who wants therapy has access to it. Once they get there, they have a lot of negative experiences, and then they don't necessarily want to go back. Now, this is interesting in a lot of ways because there's a paradox, because the way that the medical system is, it requires therapy in a lot of cases in order to move forward for gender affirming care. But we're not adequately trained in order to provide that care. So in the APA survey, so this is in the US, of all of the therapists who were polled, only 27% of the clinicians actually felt like they had received adequate training for caring for somebody who was trans or non-binary. So I think that's pretty important thing to kind of think about. It's exactly why this type of training and pink therapy is so important, right? But it's also amazing that it's not part of regular training for everybody, right? Because we can't expect that all people, all trans and non-binary people are only going to get therapy from people who seek it out. I mean, maybe that's a good thing because you're going to be better than the regular people, but there needs to be more training kind of in general. So what I'm going to talk about is two studies that really center that we recruited trans and non-binary people who have been in therapy before. So we're asking, these are not all trans and non-binary people. These are the people who had access. And we asked them about their experiences. So I'll first talk about the microaggressions that they experienced in therapy, and then I'll talk about the microaffirmations. So beginning with what are some things that could go wrong, right? And we can kind of reflect on that. And then we can also think about what are some ways that we can be more affirming, and what do clients actually feel like are affirming? Because we can think we might know what is wrong and we might not know what's affirming. But this is from the perspective of trans and non-binary clients themselves. And so I always think it's important to kind of humble ourselves and hear from our clients about what their experiences are, because we might have the best intentions, but we might not know kind of how our comments and our experiences are landing with them. So let me just, since the first study is about microaggressions, just so that we all have some basic definitions out there. This definition I have is from Kevin Nadal, but they're brief and commonplace. A lot of people talk about them as being daily, right? Daily indignities. They could be verbal, behavioral, or environmental. I think the one thing that's really important about them is that they can be intentional or unintentional, and often they're unintentional. So you don't know that you've done it. And I think that's really important to think about. You don't know that you've done it. You haven't necessarily intended it, but they communicate hostility, or they're a negative slight or an insult, particularly to somebody in an oppressed group. So I'm going to focus on thinking about microaggressions, these unintentional or intentional daily experiences that trans and non-binary individuals experience because of their gender identity. All right. So we'll think that through. The thing that I think is really interesting, and I've actually studied microaggressions in a lot of contexts. And so if you walk out in the everyday world and you're somebody in the LGBT community, you've experienced microaggressions. You've experienced them from a lot of different people. Most researchers focus on them kind of in general and not within a particular social context, but they land really differently based on who's portraying them. So if you're in a really close friendship, somebody that's really close to you, and they commit a microaggression, it might make you feel a little bit more wary of that person or less close to that person. If you receive that from a romantic partner, it might make you less trusting or able to open your heart, or be able to be sexual with them in a particular way. You're going to become more guarded. When it's with your therapist, a therapist who's there to kind of help you, a microaggression is going to be something that kind of interrupts that care. And makes you less trusting. And this is difficult because there's already a power dynamic in therapy, right? There's already this sense, and particularly for trans or non-binary individuals who may need a letter, who may need something in order to kind of move forward. So there's an enormous power dynamic already. And if the therapist is committing microaggressions, it's only going to erode any trust that might have been there to kind of begin with. And so this is, I think, a really important way to think about what that relationship looks like. There's 3 different types of microaggressions out there in the literature. So micro assaults, which are intentional discriminatory behavior. So it's intentional, but without thinking that it's offensive. So it might be somebody telling a joke and saying, "Oh, I'm just kidding." So they're expecting you not to be offended by it, but they know that it's kind of an offensive thing. It's like somebody starting their sentence with, "I don't mean to offend you, but," right? So that's a micro assault, right? Assault. A micro insult is a comment that's unintentionally discriminatory. Sometimes they're like backhanded comments, like, "I couldn't even tell that you were trans," right? Or, "You're so pretty for a trans person," right? You think that you're saying something nice, but really the underlying assumption there is discriminatory. So that's a micro insult. All right. So notice that already that's differing. A micro assault, there might be some intention. Here, this is totally unintentional. And a micro invalidation has to do with a comment that excludes or nullifies or somehow invalidates your client's experience, or in this case, your client's experiences or their reality. So it might be something that, "Oh, you'll never be a real woman," right? So or your identity by gender, it's just a Tumblr thing. It's just something that's out there kind of on the internet, right? That was actually a quote from one of my participants that they've been told by other people that bigender is just a Tumblr thing. So the sense of that is really just this idea of totally invalidating experiences or identity, really. So what I'm going to show you is and talk to you about, and that's kind of the theory and the basis for kind of why it's important. And now I'm just going to talk to you about and show you a number of quotes that came from my participants themselves. So we asked them about the microaggressions that they received from their therapist. They had a lot. Everybody had at least one microaggression. So that's something that's telling you something right there. We collected this, we did a thematic analysis, and what we found is that the microaggressions that they talked about fell into 4 different categories that really speak to the therapeutic relationship. So one category, and I'll go kind of be going through these and giving you examples, but the first category was just lack of respect for the client's identity. So there were things that the therapist said that were very clearly interpreted by the client as lack of respect. There was lack of competency, and this kind of brings back to the literature where already people were saying that therapists, they had to educate their therapist. There were microaggressions that spoke to the salience of identity. So either the therapist overemphasized and thought that everything had to do with them being trans, or they totally avoided it. So it was either overemphasizing or minimizing how they were focusing on gender in the session. And then there was also microaggressions that had to do with gatekeeping. And this is very specifically the gatekeeping that happens with therapists from allowing trans and non-binary individuals to move forward and receive the medical care that they actually also need as well. So let's just kind of hear from the participants, and these were just their quotes and their experiences. So here's one that kind of rings as the lack of respect. So one client who is gender fluid said, "One therapist flat out told me that she didn't believe anything that I told her and that I had no gender identity issues." So again, here's a situation where it's a lack of respect and a lack of really believing the client. Oops. Let's see if I can figure out. Okay. Also misgendering. This is very common for trans and non-binary people, but here's a participant saying this was happening in therapy. So this is a trans woman who is saying, repeatedly being referred to as a man with regard to how the counselor in question couldn't understand why a man would be concerned with something like hair loss, bone structure, vocal pitch, etc. This occurred at 5 sessions across 2 months. I stated explicitly that I was transgender at the first appointment and brought the topic up frequently at each subsequent session. So that's a pretty damaging thing for a therapist to just not in any way acknowledge the client's positionality and experience. Also, trans and non-binary people are often sexualized, and this came up in the therapy room as well. So here's a trans woman who said about their therapist, he wasn't subtle about anything, but always misgendered me and always casually referred to me as wanting a plastic pussy. So imagine hearing that from your therapist. Another trans woman. My first therapist was a cis male. He would sit facing me, all man spread, with his hands on his crotch, and he kept asking about my breasts, if they were real. Did I want bigger breasts? He continued this even after I told him it made me uncomfortable. I was seeing him for a letter for a gender confirmation surgery. So again, you feel that like enormous power dynamic that's there, and then also being sexualized. One of the things I want to point out is a lot of you are already seeing trans and non-binary clients, and this might seem really like, wow, this doesn't happen in my therapy room, which great. I hope that you're feeling that way a little bit. But one of the things I want you to think about is it probably happened to your clients before they got to you. So I think one thing to be aware of is to know that clients are coming in with a lot of skepticism about therapists and are looking for therapists to kind of behave differently. But this was not particularly shocking to the participants. It was damaging to them, but it was so commonplace, because that's what microaggressions are, right? That these were common experiences for them, even if they don't sound like common experiences to us. So here's some quotes about lack of competency. All the mental health care providers I met had no idea about gender identity besides male, female, and intersex. They could grasp the idea of trans people, but they certainly had no idea about non-binary and non-conforming identities. And so this is something really important to think about in terms of the diversity of the trans community, that not all trans individuals identify with binary identities, and often those experiences are very different in therapy. And so the lack of competency for therapists in understanding non-binary identities came up over and over again for our participants. There was also, in terms of lack of competency, a lot of people saying that therapists didn't understand that gender identity and sexual orientation are two different things, right? And this is made really difficult because how in the psychological literature and the medical literature, it's already been conflated anyway. Almost all trans identities early on were defined based on sexual orientation. And so even in the literature, there's a conflation. But here's a trans woman who said about their therapist hinted that maybe I wasn't trans, but just a gay man in denial. And trans women should also take a liking to men. I questioned, saying that I felt no attraction to men, and she strongly insisted I should try, or at least try to imagine myself in a situation where a man would seduce me and see how I felt. I replied that I felt no desire to go through with it, but she still insisted that I had to consider this as a possibility. Again, in the medical literature, there's often this idea that to be a true trans person, you have to be heterosexually identified. And so you see that coming out in the way treatment happens for trans and non-binary clients. The third category of microaggressions were about salience of identity. And here's a participant who's really talking about how their therapist like overemphasized gender and kind of thought everything was about them being trans. So my therapist attributes bad things to my gender. Like I had a bad relationship with my mother because I was angry she didn't give birth to a girl, which confused me because it was so far from what I feel. After the situation, I always just stopped talking because I was unable to say anything for a dozen minutes. So again, you see how it's impacting the therapeutic relationship as well. It's not only offensive, but then not being able to really engage in therapy in the same way. There's also therapists who do kind of the opposite. They minimize gender identity. She said we had better issues to focus on other than the trans issues. I was upset over this and became frustrated by how slow everything was going. So I decided to apply for an appointment at a gender clinic. Because clearly talking about identity was important to this client, but not to the therapist. And then the last category was gatekeeping. And so here are examples of where therapists were really trying to emphasize the diagnostic criteria as being important and the sole focus of therapy. I had all of the criteria for gender dysphoria except for one, phrased desire for genitals of the opposite sex. I told this to the therapist and said that very intensive symptoms of gender dysphoria were the primary drive to seek counseling, so I could discuss the possibility of hormone therapy to relieve them. And she seemed surprised. Also under gatekeeping was this idea of letters. I was informed a letter could not be obtained since I did not state that I was attracted to men. Again, putting sexual orientation kind of at the center of diagnosis. And then just denial of surgery, of services. So several therapists refused to see me and one receptionist laughed at me. So imagine going to therapy with a hope for help and that being kind of the situation. So here again is the different categories that our participants' microaggressions kind of fell into. And now I just would like you to kind of think about your own experiences and your own reactions. So as I was reading these, I want you to think about what did you notice about yourself? What was going on in your mind? What was going on in your body and your reactions and hearing the quotes? And just like, how did that sit with you? Thinking about when you heard those quotes, what perspective were you taking? Were you thinking about the quotes from the participants, from the client's standpoint, or were you thinking of it from your standpoint? Oh, I never do that, or oh yeah, I did that, whatever, right? But just thinking about that, because I think also when we're thinking about microaggressions, often our defensives make us want to focus on therapist intent, whether you meant it or not, rather than client harm. Remember, microaggressions are something that can be intentional or unintentional. But if you spend too much time being defensive and saying, hey, that wasn't my intent, then you're also not attending to the client harm. So just thinking about your perspective a little bit and having a conversation in your breakout rooms about that. And then just think of a time that you've committed a microaggression toward a client, whether it's somebody who's trans or non-binary or just in general. And maybe you can have a conversation about how you acknowledged that or didn't in the moment. I think that might be a really useful way to think about and honor, like even my participants' ability or willingness to share their stories, because they're sharing them hopefully to help us be better at kind of serving them. So I'm hoping in the breakout rooms you can really have a conversation that is honest and reflective about how you're reacting to this material. I think I need to.
So Professor Antonio Prunas is a graduate of our own program, hugely experienced researcher and clinician based in Milan. And I'm really delighted that you're here because you've also been involved in this work. And I think it was you who introduced me to the concept of microaffirmations. So it's great that you're here and sharing your experience. Please carry on.
Okay, thanks, Dominic. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank Dominic for inviting me, and also Professor Galupo for the amazing presentation. So the focus of my presentation will be on, let me share my screen. Can you see it?
It's not quite there yet. Yes, coming up.
Okay, so the focus of my presentation will be on when the therapist is the microaggressor, working through microaggressions in the therapeutic relationship with GSRD clients. So before we start, let me just tell you a few words about myself. I identify as a white cisgender gay man. My pronouns are he, him. I'm very stereotypically Italian, and I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Milan Bicocca, which is the second state university in Milan. I'm a psychotherapist and a sex therapist. I received my diploma in GSRD therapy at Pink Therapy 2 years ago, as Dominic just said. And besides teaching, I work as a therapist, both in my private practice and at the psychotherapy service at my university, which was established just a couple of months ago. And the large majority of my clients in both settings are GSRD people.
Antonio, I think your slides are a little large at the moment. They're filling up slightly more than the screen. I'm not sure why that is, but I'm not sure if other people are finding that too.
It looks okay to me.
It's fine for me, Dominic.
It must be my screen. Please carry on. Sorry. Great, carry on.
So I would like to start my presentation with a quote from Alice in Wonderland. So Alice could not help her lips curling in a smile as she began. Do you know, I always thought that unicorns are fabulous monsters too. I never saw one alive before. Well, now that we have seen each other, said the unicorn, if you believe in me, I'll believe in you. Is that a bargain? Yes, if you like, said Alice. So this is the first encounter between Alice and the unicorn, and Alice starts with a kind of microaggressive attitudes, in my view, against the unicorn. So imagine Alice is a therapist and the unicorn is her first GSRD client. The unicorn seems a little bit wiser than Alice and replies that now that they have met each other in the flesh, they can go beyond any stereotypes Alice has in mind about unicorns, and they can develop mutual trust. So I thought this could be the perfect introduction to my presentation today. Microaggressions are a universal phenomenon, and each of us is at risk of committing microaggressions against someone else. And by each of us, I mean each of us, no matter the fact that we belong to marginalized groups ourselves. Any GSRD people can be microaggressive towards another GSRD person belonging either to the same group or to any other minority group. Also, being a mental health professional does not provide any immunity from microaggressions. So the bad news is that there is no vaccine for microaggressions available yet. So no Pfizer, no AstraZeneca, and no whatever. At the same time, I think it's very important to keep in mind that committing a microaggression as a psychotherapist does not necessarily mean that you are a bad therapist or a bad person altogether, but rather that in the society we live in, the dominant worldview tends to be Eurocentric, cisgender, masculine, and heterosexual. Also, the main reason why psychotherapists are not immune from microaggressions is the fact that these kind of issues are not often properly addressed in our trainings, if they are addressed at all. So most therapists are simply offered some stigma awareness training, and therefore they're trained to just suppress discriminatory language. But this approach is very basic, very simple, and has a lot of limitations. The first limitation is that this approach leads to systematic avoidance. So therapists trained to suppress prejudice speech may overextend this rule and avoid therapeutic opportunities with their clients due to fear of making a mistake or demonstrating bigotry. So avoidance of specific topics in psychotherapy is in itself a microaggression, the more so if they are clinically relevant for the client. So for instance, imagine a gay client coming for a consultation for sexual issues, say out of control sexual behavior. The therapist might have the feeling they are walking on eggshells and dealing with this kind of issues, and therefore they can move away from them, leaving the problem completely unresolved and unspoken. Also, a suppression of prejudice can paradoxically lead to more prejudice and make it difficult to remain present in the here and now due to the emotional activation it implies. So as you can imagine, this has some damaging effects on the therapeutic relationship. And I will give you an example by showing you the results of a research I carried out with some colleagues. One of the colleagues is Annalisa that Professor Galupo mentioned before. She is hiding in the audience right now. And the study is now in press in the Journal of Clinical Psychology. So we enrolled over 130 licensed psychotherapists, mostly women. None of them had a formal training in GSRD issues. Participants were presented with an audio file of a woman introducing herself during her first therapy session. We hired a professional actress to record the file. The audio was presented in 3 different versions. All the clinical information was the same across the versions, but what changed was the identity of the client who introduced herself as either a transgender woman or a lesbian cis woman or a straight cis woman. Participants were randomly assigned to one of the 3 conditions, and we asked them to listen to the file carefully, imagining that they had that person in front of them during the first session. Also, we asked them to rate their emotions at the end of the recording and to rate 10 questions in terms of how relevant they were in forming a clinical impression of the client. 5 of these questions were neutral and 5 were microaggressive. They were selected from a previous study we carried out. So the results were that therapists were more prone to select microaggressive questions when the client identified as either a lesbian or a transgender woman. And overall, this is not a groundbreaking result. We actually expected that. But what emerged is also that this happened in particular with high levels of emotional arousal after listening to the recording. So how do we explain this? We believe that therapists are raised in social environment which reinforce heterosexism and pair sexual minorities with negativity. At the same time, they identify with the professional community, and they, of course, identify with the rules of their professional community. That is, you can't discriminate against anyone in your clinical practice. So therapists may experience discomfort related to this conflict between these 2 issues. And these again may lead to a higher rate of microaggressions, as we have seen, and also avoidance of specific topics connected to sexual orientation or gender identity. I think there is also another important limitation, that is suppressing biased language is quite easy and anyone can do it. So for example, my sister works as an accountant, and she has no psychological background, but for sure she can avoid being offensive with gay and lesbian clients. The problem is that prejudice also works at an implicit level and may manifest itself outside of the subject's awareness. So people can deny they have a biased view against a specific social group, but still be very prejudiced. And finally, even when prejudice is not there, stereotypes can still play a role. And I will give an example of that, showing you the results of another study we carried out. In this case, we enrolled 150 Italian male straight licensed psychotherapists, and they were presented with a clinical vignette. We created 2 clinical scenarios, one describing a male client with difficulties in controlling rage, and the second describing a male client struggling with out of control sexual behavior. Each scenario was then created in a straight version and in a gay version, thus providing 4 different options: gay versus straight and sex versus rage. The reason why we proposed 2 clinical conditions is that out of control sexual behavior was considered from a previous study stereotypical of homosexual clients, while rage discontrol was considered counter-stereotypical. Each participant was randomly assigned to one of the 4 clinical conditions. And after reading the clinical scenario, we asked therapists to basically do their job. So they had to formulate diagnosis they consider more plausible, or they had to formulate severity ratings, need for medication, or assess amenability to psychotherapy. That is the benefit they expected the client will have from psychotherapy with them. And this is basically the main result we found. So the variable here is amenability to psychotherapy. So if you compare the two columns on the right, you will see that in the gay stereotypical condition, that is out of control sexual behavior, the gay patient, that is the dark column, was rated as less amenable to psychotherapy than the straight patient suffering exactly from the same condition. And by contrast, such a difference did not emerge in the counter-stereotypical scenario, that is rage discontrol. So it's the two columns on the left. What was striking was also that we could detect no implicit or explicit prejudice. We were quite surprised, actually, because these people were straight, male, Italian psychotherapists, and apparently they had no relevant levels of prejudice, both at implicit level and explicit level. I hope you agree with me that there is no reason to believe that being gay makes you less amenable to psychotherapy in case you have out of control sexual behavior. Actually, according to the therapists, probably out of control sexual behavior is more difficult to treat in gay guys because they are promiscuous by nature. So that's the way they are. And therefore, they need more efforts in terms of psychotherapy to be helped and probably cured. So our findings suggest that even in the absence of prejudice, you have a huge bias against gay clients only when their difficulties are related to stereotypical disorders. So not when we're talking about psychological issues in general. I think there are several implications here. First of all, is that this is a very automatic and super fast process. So this is a conclusion that the therapist reaches after reading 15 lines of a clinical vignette. So they have not even met the client yet. And also, this is all in the therapist's head. So it might go completely undetected. It does not even translate into a microaggression in this case. However, this has a lot of relevant implication for a therapeutic process. So the energy, the effort, and the commitment that the therapist is going to put in the therapeutic enterprise will be influenced by these assumptions, as you can imagine. So the conclusion is that microaggressions are, to some extent, absolutely inevitable, and just trying to avoid them is not enough, and sometimes it might have exactly the opposite effect. And so the next question is, how can we handle microaggressions in psychotherapy? Actually, I could find two specific approaches exploring this issue in detail. Acceptance and commitment therapy and functional analytic therapy. I will focus a little bit more on ACT, but you have reference here, so in the reference list at the end, so you can expand in case you're interested. ACT stresses the importance of experiencing and not avoiding painful emotions and thoughts, and is based on 6 principles. This approach contrasts with more traditional cognitive and behavioral methods that seeks to alter the form and frequency of internal states, and assumes that behavior change can occur without without changing thoughts or internal states. This is an example of how these principles can be applied on a situation in which the therapist commits a microaggression against a client. So flexible perspective taking. I'm a person with a history, and that history just showed up in a very painful way for my client and for me. Cognitive diffusion. Although my mind tells me I'm a bad therapist, I can hold both my effect and my intent, acceptance, and be open to how it has impacted this person I care about. Committed action. By slowing down, acknowledging what happened, creating a context where my client can be fully heard, values, and being open to my client's pain to deepen our connection. Present moment awareness right now in this very moment. So according to Steinwachs and Szabo, instead of fearfully scrutinizing their responses for microaggressions, therapists can engage fully and openly, knowing that they will make missteps and that they can take responsibility for doing so. Using the language of another theoretical framework, working through microaggressions in therapy may serve as an opportunity to strengthen the client's reflective functioning, which has been shown to moderate the impact of stigma and rejection on the well-being of transgender and gender non-conforming people. What is reflective functioning? Reflective functioning refers to our capacity to understand ourselves and others in terms of intentional mental states, such as feelings, desires, wishes, goals, and attitudes. This is a very recent study carried out by some colleagues in Naples. And this is an online study including around 200 transgender and gender non-conforming people. They are people from the community with an age range between 18 and 70. The authors explored the relationship between rejection, internalized transphobia, and mental health assessed as anxiety and depression. And they found that mentalization moderated the relationship between rejection and internalized transphobia with mental health, so that the more reflective functioning skills the person has, the more the effect of rejection and internalized transphobia on mental health is buffered. This is one of the author's conclusions at the end of the paper. So basically the authors say, transgender and gender non-conforming people with inadequate reflective functioning may be capable of developing an intrapsychic system able to filter traumatic and negative experiences. Such a filter may allow to metabolize these painful experiences as something that does not depend on one's own identity. As a result, they are less likely than those with low reflective functioning to undermine the self-concept and expectations of others. I think that in line with the topic of this presentation, we can, in a way, reword this conclusion by saying that such a filter may allow to metabolize these painful experiences as something that may not be perpetrated on purpose by the therapist in case of a microaggression or with a deliberate intent to hurt. So what to do when you are the microaggressor? The first thing to do is not being defensive. So you should basically take stock of your feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, whether it's fear of appearing transphobic or homophobic, or anger about being confronted by the client. So the main issue is that it's not about you in that moment, but it's about the other person who's taking a risk and sharing this sensitive information with you. Also, you should acknowledge that the other person is hurt, apologize, and reflect on where microaggression came from and how to avoid that in the future. You should also take responsibility for increasing understanding of your own privileges, and don't minimize the situation. Minimize the situation might be, for example, putting the blame on the client in a way by saying, for example, that they are too sensitive. And this is already another form of microaggression. Also, it could be important to explicit from the very beginning of the consultation the probability that you will commit microaggressions. When microaggressions happen, you should directly and openly discuss microaggressions as they occur. But this is possible only when you create a therapeutic relationship in which the client feels free to discuss their feelings in case a microaggression happens. And also, another very important opportunity is to use microaffirmations. So you can use it. You can use them like there's no tomorrow, because they're very powerful to enhance the relationship with the client. So my conclusion is that as long as microaggressions do not remain invisible or unspoken in the therapeutic relationship, not only they can be repaired, but they might provide invaluable opportunities for helping the client developing skills to buffer the impact of stigma and rejection inside and outside of the consultation room. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Antonio. You have a question for people to talk about in their breakout rooms, I think. Here we have it on the screen. Kaz will be lining those up, a different group for you this time, so you get to meet some new people. And we'll set you for 15 minutes because he's finished just slightly ahead of time, which is great. So there's a little bit more time for you to go into your breakout rooms and talk about that. Thank you so much, Antonio.